Welcome to what is, I guess, pushing now our 20th Sharpen Your Axe session. For those of you who are not familiar with Sharpen Your Axe, it's a little parable from, if you will, I think it was Abraham Lincoln that it was attributed to. I won't bore you with the story about Sharpen Your Axe, but I encourage you to go to our website and read it, or Google it. It's a very interesting story about two lumberjacks. And we use Sharpen Your Axe as a forum for discussion around leadership topics. We do it in two different formats generally. One is a panel, such as you see here today, and the other is a roundtable setting where we bring in leaders, CEOs, etc., and we talk about topics of relevance. My name is Hart Hillman. I'm the CEO of the Bigwin Group. On behalf of our team, our co-sponsors, Samsung and Reuters, we're delighted to welcome you, and of course, our very esteemed panel on a subject that is, I think, not only timely, but really relevant, and the fact that you guys have come out early and found parking in this area and come to the store. And Paul tells me the store will be opening at 10 shortly after we finish our session, so feel free to browse and enjoy the fabulous products. The Sharpen Your Axe series was started about 6 years ago. We've done two in India, in Mumbai and New Delhi. We've done some in New York, and we've done, as I said, about 14 now in Canada. We've looked at topics such as CSR, innovation, how to build cultures of innovation. Wow.
There you go.
Technology.
We have other people in Young Dundas Square listening to
Technology.
I'm now intimidated by this thing here. Is that better?
Yes.
They really can get me downstairs, right? Okay, perfect, great, okay. So, we continue to try and broker these kinds of discussions around leadership, around HR-related topics, around leadership-related topics. And again, today's topic around diversity, and by the way, you'll hear from one of our guests and surprise speakers that it's no longer just around a topic about diversity, but there's other language and other narrative that you can use to describe it. You're going to hear how that's changed. The whole diversity conversation, the affirmative action conversation has changed such that it's now about not only just inclusion, but let's call it equity hiring and where that fits in. Before I introduce our moderator and panel, some housekeeping. We'll be finished today's session at 10 o'clock sharp. And I think we have about 15, 20 minutes, half an hour where you can spend some time with the panelists or with your fellow guests here and talk, but then at 10:30 the store is well open at that point, so we'll move on. So our job right now is to stimulate you, to provoke you, to entertain you, to educate you. Your job is to listen and participate. Should you finish your job before we finish our job, please kindly head down the stairs. Before I turn it over to our moderator, Janet, I would ask that each of the panelists just quickly, and you all have mics or will have mics, tell us something about yourselves that we wouldn't learn on your CV, on your resume, on your websites. Tell us about a passion, a hobby, an interest, something that speaks to what moves you. Who would like to go first?
Good morning. My name's Adrian. I know how to drive a tank, and I am a really good golfer, considering how short I am. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Rachel Ah, and I'm embarrassingly passionate about the news. It's embarrassingly passionate about the news. I watch news day in and day out. My husband has said he might leave me at some point if I didn't stop, but it's something I'm extremely passionate about.
I'm Suzanne Truesdale. I am incredibly passionate about cooking, and I get quite obsessed by it. I have a cooking background, and I have given myself a goal that by December I will create the most perfect oven-baked baguette without a professional graham.
left-hand lane that are not keeping up with the flow. That would not be on my resume.
I'm Tasha Rappel. Something that's not on my resume is that I once trained as a birth doula, helping women give birth. And my most famous birth was helping a very tall Russian woman who didn't speak a word of English give birth right in the middle of a hotel lobby in Dubai.
That's a tough one to follow. I'm very relieved, actually. My name is Janet Ludo. I have a two-year-old daughter at home. What you would not know is that I can sing pretty much the entire soundtrack to several Disney movies. I don't say I can sing it well, but we get through it. And I know almost every word. So to start our panel today, thank you everyone so much for coming.
If I may, Trevor, we have a guest.
Oh, of course.
As well. Trevor, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm the late Trevor Wilson, I guess, because I wasn't invited to the panel, but I will be speaking afterwards.
But Trevor
what's on
put
my
his schedule upside down to be here, so we thank him for that.
and I'm jet lagged, which is why my eyes are watering. What's not on my resume? Why I got 3 kids, that's not on my resume. So I have Alex at 32, very, very introverted. I have Brianna at 20, she's at McGill right now, almost finished, and she's my favorite. And I know I'm supposed to say favorite girl, but she's actually my favorite. And James, James is a hellion. James is 15. He's an amazing, amazing kid, and I'm proud of all of them.
We'll be sure to send an email to the other ones that are So thank you everyone very, very much for coming this morning. I realize it's early and as Heartside, I realize parking can be an absolute nightmare. Thank you for starting your day with us. As you know, my name is Janet Ludo. So I am a lawyer with a law firm that is actually right at Young and Dundas. I practice in corporate commercial civil litigation and employment law. So in my employment law practice, I tend to come across issues that have to do with diversity and inclusion. But as a litigator, I often come at them from the wrong side. So usually when people come and see me is when they've encountered a problem or they've received a complaint and they need to know what to do. Sometimes people come in proactively. Some of the best requests I get that are actually kind of most interesting to deal with are people who are putting together policies and they need to know sort of where the requirements are, where the law puts them, and how they can comply. Some people want training, although that sounds proactive. That's usually not proactive. It's usually, again, we've got a problem, how do we fix it? We need to train our employees. And sometimes we get people looking for advice about workplace accommodations, what kind of leaves they're required to give their employees. So that's sort of where I find it. The reactive side is probably way more common. That's usually when people have had a complaint and they need a workplace investigation, that kind of thing, or when there's litigation and there are allegations of discrimination against an employer. So that's most of what I see, and I'm so excited today to get the opportunity to move beyond that and start looking at the role and opportunity of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And that's where I'm hoping that I can learn from our panelists today, and we can have a very interesting discussion. So, again, coming at it as a lawyer, what I tend to see is a very sort of category-focused definition of diversity, because that's what we have in our laws in Canada. It looks at things like race, ethnicity, gender, family status, which is a personal one for me at the moment, as I'm 6 months pregnant. Ability, language, country of origin, all of these things, they're sort of factors that you can name and that you can list. But there's also an approach to diversity that looks at more subjective factors, things that you can't necessarily categorize, such as somebody's background, their skills, their experiences, their manner of thinking. And what we can get at today, we can get at these different meanings of diversity. Sometimes businesses tend to use one as a proxy for the other. So that can create some kind of interesting approaches, interesting tensions, interesting conflicts. But all in all, I think what we can get at today is diversity is a fluid concept that has many different meanings. And there are many, many things that a business can do to foster diversity. So in this panel today, I'm hoping that we can move beyond the minimum requirements that are so much of what I see on a day-to-day basis and look at the opportunities that exist for businesses. There are a lot of studies, and I will not go through them because you're probably all familiar with them, that show that workplaces with strong diversity among their staff and in their culture benefit from increased innovation, more productivity, happier employees. The number of studies that have shown this is just endless. So, taking it as a given that those are all great things that an employer would want, how do we get there? We're going to move through a series of questions where we discuss some of the strategies that employers can use to foster diversity, where they're successful, where they're less successful, how different approaches to diversity can fuel outcomes for a business and its employees, and opportunities for where things can go from here. So this is an exciting, important, and very timely discussion that we're also thankful that you're able to be here to participate in. For this morning's panel, I would like to welcome each of our panelists to introduce themselves, take a few minutes, tell us your perspective, some of the initiatives that your business is engaging in, and anything else that you would like to tell us right up front while we are all well caffeinated and comfortable. So whatever you want to say, this is a great time to do it and just introduce us to your perspective. Then I'm going to ask a few questions, and then I would like to invite you to ask a few questions. And that said, I think as much as I just said, I will start with the questions. If you have a burning question that is relevant to what we're talking about, I would invite you to, stick your hand up and ask it at the time. Don't let the moment pass you by. So seize the day. And with that said, I'll turn the mic over to Adrienne. There you go.
You sure you want to start with me? Well, good morning. Thank you very much for having me here. If you don't like what I have to say, get in line. And I'm happy you can tweet at me or just send nasty notes to Hart for having me here this morning. But it is an early morning, and it's a weighty topic, obviously, to start Thursday with such what I think is actually a very important conversation. One of the greatest thinkers, I think, in the world is Dr. Thomas Sowell, and he once said that if we were to have a new book in the Guinness Book of World Records for the overuse, it's the word diversity. And I think everybody talks about diversity, it means many of the things that our wonderful moderators talked about, where you come from, your skill set, and all of these other things. But in my world, in the manner and in the world in which I exist in, it's not necessarily about diversity of what you look like. It's also diversity of your opinion and your viewpoint. And I think that's often something that most of you who are in the business world don't necessarily think about. But I constantly do, being in the newspaper industry. But it is, I want to answer the thesis question that we actually have before us right now, and whether workplace diversity has an impact on your success. Well, the answer is yes. Of course it has an impact on your success. It helps you make more money, it gives you more perspective, it brings diverse opinions to the table. I think that with many of the studies that anybody could look at, or you could quibble with, you would see that if you just have this sort of homogenous perspective, you don't really move your company, you don't move the dial, so to speak. So obviously having more women at the table, more younger people at the table, millennials for God's sake, get them in the workplace, and people from different countries and different backgrounds and different experiences, all of that matters. But here's where I would only say that I don't want or think that a government should legislate it and mandate it for someone to just simply be a tick box. I can say I'm from Saskatchewan, my parents are originally from India, I have been in the military, I have been in politics, I now run a newspaper, I've done all of these sorts of things proudly on my own. No affirmative action program helped me, and nor would I have ever wanted to be considered to be a token. And I think that's part of the frustration that I have with many of the discussions with respect to diversity. That's not meaning to make it, but there is a difference between diversity and discrimination, which I think is what has happened, and we're sort of in the business context making up for what may have been historical discrimination against certain ethnicities and minorities that were coming into Canada, for example. I know we have a lengthy conversation that we're about to have, but I would only just end with one thing. Toronto is the most diverse city in the world. We all know that, pretty much every single language. I love it, it's wonderful, it's fabulous. As a newspaper editor of one of the largest newspapers in the country, I constantly strive to have a newsroom that is reflective of the city in which I'm covering. But I am constrained by a very simple thing, and that's a union. And obviously things are challenging in the newspaper business these days, as you can imagine. And we have a very simple and sad reality. You're last in and you're first out. So even if I can hire that amazing, young, new, smart journalist who may not necessarily, maybe from a minority community or whatever, they're usually the first one out the door based on sort of the trends in my industry. So with that, I will pass it along.
I don't know how I'm going to follow that. Suzanne Truesdale from TELUS, and I think this is going to be an absolutely brilliant discussion because I agree with lots of what you say and have some opposing opinions on some of the things that you've just talked about. But I think that where I really agree with what's been said around diversity and inclusiveness is incredibly important in corporate Canada. And I think corporate Canada has had very genuine aspirations of how we get there, and I think we've put a lot of good policies and a lot of good desires in place. I think we have a long way to go to actually put them in play. Right? And there's a difference between policies and then really, really innately understanding the benefits that, diversity, inclusiveness from the entire spectrum. And I'm a huge fan of diversity from an educational perspective because I've seen it drive new kinds of innovation. And I'm very proud of what we've done in the organization at TELUS. What we've done, and probably the most important thing I think we've done corporately is when we set out to really become and reflect the community and the customers that we served, we really had to look internally and realize that we actually weren't that diverse. And to your point, Canada is an incredibly diverse country, and companies, in order to be successful, really need to reflect the customers that they represent and do business with every day. So very proud of what we've done from a culture perspective and a value perspective at TELUS, but really am personally pushing hard and trying to lead from, okay, let's really get those initiatives into everyday meaningful play, and that's when I really think our company and other companies in Canada will be truly diverse and truly inclusive when it's more than just words or policies on a board.
Pass that. We have our own mic, Suzanne. That's okay. We'll hog it from you. Good morning, my name is Paul Brennan. I'm with Samsung Canada. And it's an interesting question about diversity, and I was reflecting on it the other day from our company's perspective. And frankly speaking, sorry, Art, you want to see my face. Diversity is probably the foundation of what's made Samsung successful. We're a Korean-based company, hail from the Republic of South Korea. And if we didn't embrace diversity from our roots back 30 years ago here in Canada, we wouldn't have been able to be successful. So the mandate from the management was, as we go abroad and go into France, Germany, United States, Canada, it was important for us to bring in leadership that was from that culture because we need to embrace partners and consumers in that marketplace. So diversity from the beginning was an important part of what we stood for as a company. And it's kind of evolved past that aspect of it to a point that that's how we actually take things to market. So we were a fairly siloed organization between TVs, home appliances, and phones. And we most recently embarked upon something called One Samsung. And One Samsung talks to it from a products perspective, but it also talks from a diversity of thought perspective. inside of our organization, which I think is really important. So instead of hiring a lot of like-minded thinkers in each one of these divisions, what we've started to go out and is hire people that have different thoughts and opinions, and you're actually sitting in an environment that was created based on that. And this was an idea that was developed here in the Canadian marketplace. And frankly, this is the largest store that Samsung has globally up until recently. And in fact, this is one of 6 stores in the Canadian marketplace. And historically, inside of our company, we never thought about being in the retail environment because it would create conflict with our partners. But a lot of new thinkers and new people brought into the organization actually brought a diversity in the way we think about taking things to market, how we engage with consumers. So I think it's really important that you take diversity of thought and diversity of your organization into account, and we've done that throughout our organization. We continue to do it here in the Canadian marketplace. We have millennial groups inside of Samsung because our biggest challenge is getting those millennials to join our organization and frankly to stay with the organization. We've started something, Women at Samsung Canada, Women at Seika, which is a group of like-minded women and women who get inspired by other women inside the organization. We've taken that and actually made it a North American mandate inside of our company too. So we share that with people both north and south of the border. Inside of our management team in Canada, 22% of our leadership are actually females. And that's been over the last 11 years that I've been with the organization that we've made that change. And what it's really brought is really different thinking to our organization and the way we take products to market and services to service Canadian consumers.
Good morning. My name again is Rachel Ah, and to me, so one of my favorite quotes is a quote from Tim Cook that really says, simply states, the thing that makes the world interesting is not our similarities, but not our similarities, but our differences. And so I also think that the thing that makes the world difficult could also be our differences. As I said earlier, I'm somebody who's extremely passionate about the news. I read and listen and watch it every day. And I can't always help but think what the world would be like if we really understood our differences better. So if each person could really understand what makes the other person different in thought and their customs and traditions, how different would the world be today? So to me, diversity is really just truly understanding the differences between one another. All of us sitting here in the room, I find it fascinating that we can all be presented with the same set of facts and information and data, or listen to the same information, and still we could all have a different perception or come up with a different conclusion that's equally as compelling and equally as interesting, all driven by our background and our experiences, which is all just a product of where we were born, where we lived, who we socialized with, who we went to school with, and who we work with on a day-to-day basis. So on average, each of us will spend at least 90,000 hours of our lives working. So I think it makes it safe to say where we work plays a huge role in shaping who we are and shaping our thoughts of the world around us and how we interpret our differences. So I think we'll all agree that diversity in the workplace is such a huge opportunity and fundamental opportunity for us to really understand and shape how we think about the world around us. So we have this great opportunity to work with people of different cultures, customs, and traditions, and understanding how those customs and traditions and cultures behave in different contexts, different settings, and what that means to us and how we shape the world. And so most importantly, taking that knowledge and passing it to the next generation in the hopes of fostering a generation that has a more balanced worldview and more tolerance and understanding to different cultures and people around the world. So to me, I think saying the word diversity in the workplace, it's just not ticking that box, but really companies have to do a better job at really getting to the root of it. What does that actually mean? Are we creating opportunities for people to actually, when we do bring in diverse people, to assimilate into the organization? And I think the onus is not really only on the organizations, it's on each and every one of us, especially people who are in the minority group. What are we doing to make sure that, when we do get this opportunity, that we're taking advantages and we are making sure that our voices are heard and that we can pass on that diversity to the next generation?
I'm going to try and follow my fellow panelists here. I'm Natasha Rappel, executive marketing consultant. I wouldn't consider myself an expert on diversity, but I've lived it my whole life. I'm of mixed heritage. I'm from the UK. When I first came to Canada, interestingly, I would get this mini pause as I would speak, as people were trying to sort of like figure, as one of my friends said there, you know, that is it fake? Is it a fake accent? Diversity in the workplace was really a topic of my upbringing. My father's was an Indian teacher. He was a very active member of the Asian Teachers Association back in the 70s in Britain. My mother came over, she fled small town Greece in pursuit of a career, and she quickly found herself pulled aside one day early on as a factory worker in the UK, and was pulled aside for apparently being over-friendly with some of her female colleagues. She was just being Greek, you know, she was just being affectionate and friendly with her, you know, with her colleagues. And then later on, as a social services worker, found herself in the middle of a discrimination case when they introduced quotas, and there was unfortunately a number of incompetent employees into the organisation as they started to water down the entry criteria. Real forwards to today, I'm fortunate to have worked in extremely diverse organisations. I've held international marketing positions. I've worked, you know, in a women in tech ratio of almost 50%, and yet still I can count numerous examples where the same behaviour that was displayed by a woman that would be called emotive might be called passionate for one of my male counterparts, or one of our leaders who had a learning disability wasn't properly accommodated for his different processing styles, and you know, the list goes on and on. I think today, you know, to echo what some of my colleagues have said here, today we're working in a very globalized economy. None of us live and work in an insular environment, and companies absolutely need to be diversified, to remain competitive, in order to interact with our consumers and understand our consumer base and our colleagues and our different colleagues in other countries. But one of the issues is that, for me, diversity is not just accepting and understanding diversity, but it's actually really valuing that diversity and embracing those differences. And managing diversity is not just about equal opportunities, employment opportunities, and affirmative action. It's about really getting under the skin of those individual differences and embracing those individual differences. And that's how we can win as a company and as a country, actually.
Thank you so much, everyone. And as I mentioned earlier, we're fortunate to have Trevor Wilson here with us today. He is the author of this book, The Human Equity Advantage. And now I'd like to invite Trevor to say a couple of words. If you could tell us what inspired your book, and a little bit about yourself, and anything else you'd like us to know.
What inspired the book? I was telling the panel actually about this. I worked in the field of diversity for about 20 years. I wrote a book 20 years ago called Diversity at Work. And we were invited to South Africa for Coca-Cola to do work on their diversity strategy. And it was really their employment equity strategy or affirmative action strategy. And the CEO of the company stood up and basically started on employment equity, and then slipped and said human equity. And this little voice spoke inside of me and said, there's something called human equity. He doesn't know what it is, you don't know what it is, just stay with it. And they didn't say stay with it for 10 years, but it took about 10 years, till May of 2011, final piece came together. And human equity is relatively simple. It's about maximizing on the total human capital available to your organization. And you can't do that just for women. You can't do that just for people of color. You can't do that just for visible minorities. So I moved from becoming an advocate of diversity to becoming an advocate of human equity. And you know, there's a couple of things that I've learned about that. When I first met Hardin, we just met like within the past week. I gave him a little bit of a hard time in terms of saying, so do you count in this diversity conversation? And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, you sound like what we call swabs, straight, white, able-bodied males. And in the past 30 years, swabs are usually the group that's left out. And so we had this conversation about if in fact you're dealing with truly equitable and inclusive work environments, you better include straight, white, able-bodied males. You can't create a work environment that's just fair just for women. You can't create a work environment that's fair just for people of color. If it's fair for me as a black male, then as for any of you, it is no longer fair. It has now become unfair. So that's in my 5 minutes, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. So what a great start. I've been taking notes this whole time because interesting themes keep coming up. And I think that they play really, really well into some of the questions that I was hoping that we could ask. I know Adrian and Rachel mentioned sort of some of the approaches to diversity that can lead to people feeling like a tick box. So one of the things that I hear that the most about is in hiring, when companies put in place quotas or targets. And you know, I think it's a reaction that people often have. So say you are in a business and then you look around the room and you realize that all of a sudden 90% of your executive is very, very similar. So say you're in a company, 90% of your executive is male, and you decide, okay, we need to do something about this. We're going to take action today. A role has come up, and now we're going to screen, we're going to interview at least 70% female candidates. And I think that happens a lot. So is there a place for quotas and targets in businesses and organizations? Are there risks associated with that approach? Are there benefits, and are there good alternatives? I'm very interested to hear what you have to say. So if anyone can't wait to get started, I would invite you to go first. Otherwise, I'll start with Natasha.
I think, yes, there is a place for it, but I would say it's more directional than I think there's certainly risks with it, as to the example that I spoke to earlier, where we saw in social services in Britain that even the university actually entered with requirements for the courses had been massively watered down. And we saw an influx of candidates coming forward because it was the easy course option to choose, and then later on an easy employment opportunity. So you had perhaps slightly the wrong motivations for the placement on both sides of the companies. And especially in a field, in a caring profession like social services, I would say you have to be even more cautious, although you still need to have a good representation. So finding the balance is difficult. You know, going for a more radical change is not for me the ideal option. I think we need to look more to a transformative change where we have short-term solutions to enact good change, but we, in the long term, look to seek to challenge those power systems.
So I think. So I think there's no easy and quick and solution that will satisfy everybody when it comes to something like this. And I think as a society or companies, we need to rip off that bandage and be able to really talk about it and not shy away from hearing the words quotas and quotes. Like, and I try to rationalize, like, what other way could you possibly do it? And I can't think of it. I haven't heard any good other way. So I think if a company truly wants to be diverse and they know that's part of their core values, and they talk about that, and they let their organization know this is what we are doing, we have to put things like quotas in place just to make sure that we can meet that, because we're at a deficit. We're making up, I think Adrian mentioned it before, we're making up from discrimination in the past, and we're trying to make up for it now. And something like quotas and targets are probably one of the best or most effective ways that we know of now to do it. And I think if the stigma is taken away and we talk about it more openly, I think it'll be more accepting and people will understand, so that when we do say, you know what, we need to balance this out, what we have now, and that means we are going to hire 70% more women, and we're open about it, I think people will be more understanding and accepting to it again if it's part of our core values, and we all agree that that's what we're trying to do.
Accept or, realize that the current pace of change has been slow. And I really believe that in order to affect change, we're going to have to interrupt the current way that we approach making sure that we truly become diverse. And I understand the argument around mandated quotas, etc. But I think when there are targets in place, especially at the executive level, and then that translates down through the entire organization, targets drive accountability, right? And targets are transparent. Like when an executive team says, we are going to put our brand, our culture, our leadership behind really truly becoming a diverse organization. I believe that targets do need to be in place. I agree that, and I think that should be taken on internally from an organizational perspective, and maybe not necessarily from a government, interference or interaction perspective. But, I've been around the business for a long time, and as I've said before, I truly believe the intent is genuine, but there hasn't been enough action, and there hasn't been enough output for us to really stand up and say, we are a culturally diverse organization that truly embraces the entire spectrum of diversity. And so I am a fan of putting targets in place, because I think the time has come to really, put our actions where our thoughts are, and really be able to demonstrate to the talent that we're trying to attract into the organization that we've actually done something, and we're starting to move our corporate dial forward. So that's those are my thoughts on that.
So I don't want to be indelicate about it, but quotas, no, targets are acceptable. I think that's a reasonable way of putting it. And I think you have to separate the two. I think if you implement a quota system, you're ostensibly putting the person you're hiring in that quota, setting them up for failure. Because all you're doing then is saying, I'm going to hire Vismin here. I have this criteria I want them to adhere to. I have this government mandated policy that I have to fulfill. Then what if that person doesn't work out? Next time around, you're going to go through your hiring process, and you're going to think, well, we kind of tried, we gave it the old college try, but it failed miserably. And so I think from that perspective, the notion of a quota is, well, it's insulting. And but as I think Suzanne put it quite elegantly, the notion of targets are far more achievable and a reasonable conversation for any large corporation, small or large, frankly, to have. And I think if, here's an example. Did you know that the City of Toronto, and I say this because it was a friend of mine that passed this motion at council, the City of Toronto will not do business with a vendor unless they have a certain percentage of women on their board. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine having to, as a private company, twist yourself into a pretzel in order to be a vendor for the City of Toronto, to find women just for the sake of finding women in order to do business with them? I mean, I find that ridiculous. I find that stupid. And I think that it's irresponsible public policy. Because again, it comes back to my original notion that you're simply setting those up for failure. I don't wholeheartedly disagree with the notion of all of these very thoughtful conversations that are clearly happening in boardrooms all across the country. And I think those conversations matter, and they are important. And as a leader in a newsroom, it's up to me to sort of set that tone. It's up to me to set that sort of trend with how we want to be perceived, or whatever the case may be. But again, quotas are just a setup for disaster, and it's a very easy thing for lazy governments to say that we just simply need this quota. So that's where I would fall on that.
Always glad to follow you, Adrian. No matter what I say. I think from a Samsung Canada perspective, the leadership team wants to drive diversity inside of our organization. And I think it's important for us to have diversity, as I mentioned earlier, because I sell to a diverse set of consumers inside the marketplace. So if we continue to have like-minded thinking inside of our organization, we ended up with similar customers and we don't expand outside of that perspective. So we don't have quotas inside of our organization, but we seek to hire the best candidates inside of our organization with a perspective of looking for somebody with diversity of thought first. And that diversity of thought sometimes can come back from a gender perspective or racial or ethnic standpoint at the same time. So there's no direct quotas on that side of it. We also have a very extensive kind of panel hiring process. So it's not like-minded people hiring we take a broad perspective across the organization, specifically in leadership positions. Because I think if you're going to drive a mandate around diversity inside of your organization, it has to start at the leadership level and then filter down through the organization. If you don't lead with that, then you'll never achieve it. Because if the upper part of your organization continues to hire like-minded people, you end up with like-minded people below in the organization, and it doesn't allow you to drive change in your business, which, ultimately for us, we sell products and services, it's important for us to figure out how we drive new products and services in the marketplace with different thoughts and different opinions.
So, to pick up on a couple of those themes, I know that in the legal market, there's often a lot of emphasis on what people call fit in hiring, and in recent years that's come under a lot of fire because it has kind of historically tended to people hiring people who think like them, people who went to the same schools as them, people who share similar backgrounds to them. Now we've gotten to a couple of things like targets or panel hiring. Are there any ways that you can think of, first of all, is that a problem that you've encountered in your businesses? And is there a way around it that you've seen, or something that really doesn't work? And Paul, I'll go back to you since you're just speaking sort of on the panel hiring.
I'm trying to reflect on this one. Can you kind of bring it back to me? Sorry.
I sure can.
Okay.
Is anyone, Rachel, do you have any thoughts on the subject?
Jenna, could I say
Yeah,
one
of
word
course.
about the last question?
Oh yeah, of course, Robert. Thank you.
I have a small microphone here. I just wanted to say on the issue, and I totally agree with Adrian, mandatory quotas definitely do not work. So no to mandatory quotas, but hardly endorse yes for targets and goals. And really the difference is who sets them. So if the government is setting the number, it usually becomes a quota. If it's a target, we have targets all the time. We set financial targets every quarter, every year. But I think the secret is not just having one metric. And years ago, like 40 years ago, they talked about the balanced scorecard in HR. It's the same thing. The problem with using just representation as your source of measurement is that it's slow, number one, and it's a lagging metric. So if I walk into an organization and the senior executive group are five white able-bodied males, and 10 years I walk in, they're 5 white able-bodied females, something has changed. But I don't know what has changed. I have to go back through the 10 years and say, oh, what they do this year, this year. You have predictive metrics. For those of you that are doing properly designed employee engagement surveys, and when I say properly designed, they're asking the right question. The Carswell 12 are the questions, and they are put in through a diversity lens. You know there are predictive metrics in your engagement survey. So if you find out 80% of your women feel that they're in a Me Too work environment, it's highly likely that the retention rate of women in your organization will shift. You don't have to be an Einstein to figure that out. That's a much more important metric than which is not to say representation doesn't matter, it's just a small part of it. The most important metric is the behavior of your leaders, and that is rarely measured in an organization, which relates to your culture conversation.
And I think, if I can weigh in there, I think sometimes too often who sits on our boards and who sits in our executive leadership team is incredibly important. But when you think about big organizations and you really want to drive true diversity through, I think we have to really, really focus around that around the feeder. So our new leaders, our new team members that are coming in, because they're at the top of that funnel, or where the executive sits, is a very small team. And if you're ever going to change a corporate culture, you need to be really, really feeding into the first level of leadership, really a diverse team from, and I keep saying across the whole spectrum, because to me diversity just isn't about gender. That's when I really think will make the change, because let's face it, in every big company, there are maybe, let's call it 8 to a dozen executives, and that is going to take a long time to really have that table change. But where companies can really make like a shorter term immediate change is really to start to put their diversity feelings and passion into play at the entry level. That's where we grow great, strong, diverse, capable team members, is as we bring them in and invest in them and their leadership skill capabilities. And that's how I think that then 15, 20 years from now, when that executive team, who in a lot of cases looks all the same right now, that's, I believe, when we're really going to start to see the change. But we've got to start feeding it and be really, really committed to it at the entry level point of leadership.
So to pick up on your question that you asked earlier, and actually to touch a little bit on your point there, I think, I have seen this where fit was incredibly important, particularly in a small startup environment, where we actually had a discussion at the exec level and said we actually think it's as important as 50% in terms of annual appraisals. What I did see is that when we did bring in leaders who were somehow different or had different perspectives that weren't part of that fit in terms of the same schools and the same backgrounds, what we then saw is that it was very difficult for them to assimilate, and somebody has touched on assimilation here. So instead of trying to mentor them or coach them into fitting in with the rest of the team, which ultimately ends up being a failure for them in their role, as well as very unproductive for the organisation, we need to do a much better job at trying to understand those different perspectives and embrace and endorse and bring on those and allow that individual to bring on those perspectives into the workplace, rather than trying to retrofit them back into that sort of the organisational stories and rituals and symbols that form the dominant group.
You touch on a challenge for us, because being a company from Korea, there's a bunch of cultural stereotypes that we have of Korean-based companies. And some of the time when we interview people, we look for cultural fit, part of our conversation. But we don't take that as the only part of the equation, because again, coming back to my earlier comment, if you continue to have people that are cultural fit, that are like-minded, we don't grow and we don't expand and we don't change. So cultural fit is part of it, but we also look for people who are going to come in and challenge some of the boundaries that we have inside of our organization and push us outside of our comfort zones, because it's really easy to stay in my nice warm little area and not be forced outside of it. And I think at least the way we've changed over the last few years at Samsung Canada is to look for people who are going to get us to think differently about the business. If they're a cultural fit, it's a bonus, but it's not the deciding criterion on how we hire people. We look for people that are going to be complementary to it. And it becomes a real challenge for the HR organization, and we've really moved that ball significantly. Spend a lot of time understanding the personality traits of those people. We work very closely with an external agency to understand the personality traits of the current team, and then we look for these people to be complementary to what we're trying to accomplish, not be similar to us and just assimilate into the organization.
So I'm going to try to touch on your question as well, Janet. There is a friend of mine, she's an entrepreneur, she works in the aerospace industry. She has a company that sells procurement solutions to government on military procurement. And she has a terrific way of talking about what's the difference between men and women when it comes to getting on boards and getting hiring and things like that. Here's what she has to say about it, and I think it's very simple, but it's very thoughtful. The difference between men and women is men write each other into the deal. Women just talk about the deal. And I think that that's a very important way of looking at it. And that, I think, is in part with respect to when you look at this broader conversation we're having about women on boards. The reason why the guy gets his buddy who he went to UCC with on the golf and plays golf with every weekend on his board is because that's what he's familiar with. That's who he knows. That's his world. That's his own limitation, and that's a limitation for his company. There's no question about that. But I do believe that that is evolving. I do believe that that is changing. In part because of discussions like this, in part because they're being forced to change. I think Samsung clearly is, and TELUS are obviously very, very good examples of the things that you two are talking about. You guys should talk to others in your big executive world about these sorts of things. I know that in the company which I'm in, Post Media, we do not have a particularly diverse board. But if we look down one or two layers, we had an editors meeting actually in the last couple of days, which was slightly torturous, but I survived. To last year, of all the editors across the chain. And it may surprise you to know that a vast majority of people that run almost every single news outlet in this country, between newspapers, radio, TV, and all three mediums, are women. CTV, CBC, Toronto Sun, Toronto Star, National Post, Ottawa City, they're all run by women. And that's fantastic. So from our corporate culture perspective, that's sort of where our executive team will move up. We will be afforded the opportunity to move up. But the old guys have to go. So there's that notion as well. And that's not mean to be disrespectful, but you feel comfortable in your position and your role, and you kind of cling on to it. It's also the problem we have with unions. But I also wanted to just quickly on one other point. My other part of my background is being in the military. And I've been recently asked to be an honorary colonel for the Queen's York Rangers. And the military, I think, is going through this transformation right now. It's a paramilitary organization that is predominantly male, predominantly white. But it's changing and it's trying to change. So there are people like myself and others that are, talking to them about other best practices that are happening sort of in the civilian world. It's slow to move. You have to change a culture, and again, it has to come from the top. And I think that the current Chief of Defence Staff, General Vance, is really trying to set a tone about what his expectations are with respect to it. It's same with the RCMP. It's same with police. So I think that it's just beyond the borders of corporations. It's also, when it's happening in our communities, in our society as a whole, where these discussions are happening. I just wanted to add that as just sort of an aside and just some perspective.
Fit matters, for sure. I remember years ago doing a presentation, Coke, and I put my first, this days of slides, put my first slide up, and this guy comes to me and says, "Take that down right away." And I said, "What's wrong?" He says, "It's the wrong red. It's not Coke Red." And now, that's part of their culture. And we all live in cultures, we all have cultures. The problem is that this is the water we live in, and you don't see it until you're outside of your culture, what your culture actually is. And what you actually don't see is the unwritten rules. The stuff that's in the policy manuals, you can read that, but it's the unwritten rules of the culture that cause people to fit or not fit. And then I don't want to drift into Hart's area, but it's very important to understand what we learned as we evolved into the human equity was the definition of merit has changed. In the old days, what you thought was merit was just the overlap between the credentials and the job title. So, if you had the right job skills and you went to Harvard and had the right degree, then you got a job. Then we look at the great talent leaders in the world. They looked at something else. They looked at these intangibles, including fit. They looked at your personality. They looked at your life experience. They looked at your values, your character values. All of that defines fit. So if your definition of merit is still very narrow, just around credentials and job experience, you will misfit, and that could lead to a job mismatch. Thank you.
Thank you. So, moving on on to our next question, I think again calls back some of the themes that we've already discussed. I'm thinking in particular of Adrian's comment about how quotas can set people up to fail. So what I'm hoping to ask the panel is whether there are some ways that businesses can approach diversity and inclusion that can actually fuel stereotypes. Or alternatively, if some of the ways that businesses do things put an unfair burden on the minority staff members that they hire. So if they hire a woman, they expect her to be more communicative. If they hire a person of color, and they expect increased innovation. All these things that these studies have shown, does actually that place an unfair burden on certain staff members?
I think when companies do it in a non-transparent way, absolutely, right? So if you don't really understand why you're there, but you look around the room and you see you're the only female or the only person of color, you immediately think that, hey, am I the token person in this room? But if they are transparent, it's part of their culture, and people understand that this is what we're trying to do. If I step in the room as the only female or the only person of color, I see it as more of an opportunity because I am trying to help this company change that culture and less as a stereotype. But I think, again, the key is being open about it and everybody understanding the value and why you are there versus feeling like you were just there to tick a box.
I think as human beings, we tend to put things in boxes. So our mind tries to organise and categorise the world around us. So it's a very natural tendency, and that's what leads to the stereotypes. So I think teaching our managers to train on diversity, not just on a group level, but on an individual difference level, but also to really check and challenge their own cultural biases. And that's something that I don't see happening. I don't see us talking to our managers and going in deep to say, let's inspect your own prejudices or biases, and let's start from there and put it on the table and be transparent, and then we can move forwards and really truly get under the skin of diversity.
I think, touching on everybody's points so far, I think it's really important to diffuse stereotypes inside an organization. I think it starts at the leadership level. And I work inside a company that's really easy to create stereotypes because you're not Korean, you didn't come from Korea, you don't understand what the company's all about. So it's really, really important from a leadership perspective that you start to eliminate them from that standpoint, because I think they end up undermining what you're trying to accomplish inside of the organization. And simple things. Inside the Korean culture, they used to work Monday to Saturdays, and they would work until 8 o'clock at night. They'd go out for dinner and they'd come back. And when we hire people inside of Canada now, there's a perception that they're joining an organization that they need to work from 8 in the morning till 8 o'clock at night and potentially be available on Saturdays. And it's really important for us as leaders inside the organization to eliminate that. And we have employees that are dispatched from Korea, so they are part of our organization, and they potentially work to that lifestyle. So for me, when I hire new people on the team, regardless of what level it is inside the organization, I have a conversation with them. It's important for you to be comfortable inside your own skin inside of this organization. And you need to be able to compartmentalize things and put things on a shelf. So if you need to get your son or daughter to dance or whatever that may be, you need to leave and do that. And it's important that you feel comfortable doing that. And I think it takes the leadership team to do that for us to eliminate the stereotypes of what we hire inside of our organization and sometimes what the perception is or the expectation is.
There's not enough hours in the day for me to talk about everybody's feelings all the time. I just can't. And it's not realistic. And again, I'm not trying to be indelicate about it, but that's just not reality. It's not my reality. It's not vast majority of people's reality. But I think Rachel touched on it and actually nailed it. If you are someone that is in that position where you are the minority, not saying token, but you are the minority, that could be you. That's your opportunity. And then you do have that opportunity to make it more open for those that may be entering your company or whatever the case may be. So that's my short answer. Trevor.
I guess the problem with stereotypes is we all how many of you done pre-conscious bias or unconscious bias training in your organization? Yeah, so it's been the flavor of the month for the past 5 years. Nothing, I'm not against it, by the way. It's all good stuff. But you know, one of the things that Banerjee, who's one of the originators of the pre-conscious bias, had said was, one, you can't get rid of this thing. I mean, you're stuck with it. It's part of the hardware, not part of the software. And the other thing is, no one group has a monopoly on bias or discrimination. So, you know, she has a 3 million person database, and if you look in that database, lo and behold, men don't have a monopoly on sexism. Lo and behold, white folks don't have a monopoly on racism. These are equal opportunity virtues. This is not an us versus them conversation. This is all of us. This is human beings. So incorporating that is a very important part of how. Now I do want you to know, I'm a living legend. I am the worst banker in the history of the Toronto Dominion Bank. They had a plaque at Yonge and Eglinton dedicated to me. I hated banking and I was lousy at banking, but in the early days, I kept getting promoted. And I got promoted the first time, I thought, okay, I deserve it. By the second time, I was like, I didn't deserve this. Now, and tokenism, when you get into that quota system, is really the issue. Now, there are some stereotypes that can serve me. You know, I'm not a great dancer, but people think I am because I'm black. But what I'm suggesting to you is you're not going to get rid of the stereotypes, so you do have to have conversations about that and learn how you can leverage it as part of your diversity strategy.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We all have biases, right? And yes, we've been talking about unconscious bias for quite a while, but I think the important thing is for us to, and to your point, is we always need to be aware that we bring those biases to everything we do at work, into our relationships, into our home life. But we need to be consciously aware of those unconscious biases and always be taking, especially in hiring conversations or team conversations, just taking that moment to pause to check our own biases. And it's so easy. One part of my role is I lead a huge sales organization in a telecommunications/tech company. So you can only imagine what the majority of our sales resources look like, right? So they're predominantly male. They come from kind of the same kind of background, either the consulting background or perhaps a business or engineering background. And I've really challenged the team over the course of many years around, no females apply. Females don't want to get into the sales organization. And I've just been so, I just want to accept that answer because I just don't believe in Toronto, Canada, Montreal that there are no able, really smart, highly effective, aggressive or incredibly assertive female salespeople. And I think we need to continually, continually challenge it because it's too hard for my leaders in my organization just to say, well, no women apply. And maybe no women did apply, so take a pause, go back out there and start looking at other sources to pull more women into the organization before we continue to hire the exact same team members that come from the exact same background, the exact same experience, right? And so I just think we always need to be aware of the biases and always take a moment to pause and think, okay, I need to approach this differently or I need to ask others for input on this. Because it's too easy just to say, well, it's just easier to do the other way.
It just reminded me of a story a friend of mine told me recently. Another person of color, and he was hiring for his team, and he had a candidate who was another person of color from the same country, and he said, I'm scared to hire this person because I don't want people to feel like I'm bringing in my people into this organization. And I said to him, well, no, this is your duty. You have to. If this person is capable and fit and meets all the criteria and interviewed well, that should be your only thing you think about. So again, I think it goes more to, again, we need to have this conversation. People need not to be afraid to bring in people of minorities. If you think they are fit, don't think that about, and it's hard, right? It's gonna take probably a generation for us to be more open about this, but we need to start somewhere. And I said, you need to start this. You need to bring it. If you feel this person, even though same country from you, looks the same like you, bring that person in and be open about it. And talk about it. Say, not only is this person fit, I am happy that this person actually does look like me as well, or represent a minority group. So I think, again, it starts from all of us, not only just the organizations and what the organizations can do. It starts from all of us and how we think and how we hire, especially minorities. If we have this opportunity, how are we opening the door for more people? How are we educating the people around us to say, this is what's important, this is what it brings to the table?
Rachel's piece. What I forgot about that, a guy was saying to me when I was getting these promotions, you know, we have equal opportunity, or you have equal opportunity now. And I said, yes, I have equal opportunity to compete. I don't have equal opportunity to fail. Because if I fail, then they're going to say, well, we tried a black guy in 1975, that didn't work. And, you know, that whole confidence, I don't want that burden. And I think the other part was, I can't remember. So when I do remember, I'll put it in.
One thing on what you said, Rachel, and maybe I'm naive in my thinking, I apologize, but I think it's really important for the leadership inside of an organization to encourage that type of thinking, right? So I always struggle with when you try to mandate things because it's disingenuous. I think if you have a leadership team that is much more open-minded and strongly encourages people to think differently about how they hire people, I think it drives great teams. If I look at my own career has been around either surrounding myself with great team members that may not even look like me, think like me, or anything. And I'm a kid from New Brunswick, so I'm probably the most outlier inside of the organization. But bringing in those different thinkers and different people inside the organization has to start from the leadership team down, and it has to become cultural inside of your company. It can't be something that HR tries to mandate. It has to be driven by the leadership. Our leadership back in Korea, I have a poster in my office, and it's going to sound kind of strange, but it's got comments on there that are in Korean and then translated to English. And as a company, Samsung, always the most senior guy was always perceived to be the most smartest guy in the room. And everybody would listen to that. There's a great chapter in the book, The Outliers, about Korean Airlines. But on this page of 5 different things, one of the things that says there, listen to your juniors. And as much as it sounds condescending, it comes with a level of sincerity inside of the organization, because these people are the ones that are going to change your company, change the way you bring different products to market, and you change the way you go after consumers. And if you don't think from that perspective, what's kind of disappointing is we have to have it on a poster in my office, but I think what's refreshing about it is we recognize it. And we recognize we need to change that from a leadership standpoint.
Part of the challenge, I think, is and I'm interested in your thoughts, is that we collectively suffer from being in the same echo chamber. That we have a panel and probably an audience that appreciates the notions and the challenges surrounding diversity. It's almost like a baked deal before we get here. We know that you're going to take a very somewhat provocative but fairly consistent view that diversity is important, that inclusion is important, that equity hiring or the equity continuum is important. And it's important for all the reasons that you've discussed, whether it's the most basic of checking off the box, or the fact that it's good for people, it's good for the organizations. What about the mass out there that aren't on side? How do you get that kind of progressive change that you've all accepted? It's clear. What do we do to the pick a percentage, 50%, 30%, 80% of your organizations that are resistant to this, both overtly and passively?
I don't agree with the premise of your question. I think a vast majority of people are on board. I don't think that there is that much resistance or resilience to the fact that you want to have a diverse workforce. I don't think that. And for those Luddites that are still knuckle dragging, then that's their problem. They're going to get out the door anyway. So I think the word echo chamber is a good thing. It's like all of us journalists on Twitter. It's basically an echo chamber who can come up with the most clever tweet. But it is part of this conversation that we have not had. It's been predominantly focused on the halls of the executive level, and I understand that because of who we're speaking with. But we haven't talked about the aspect of diversity, not for diversity's sake, right? Why, like, the slogan for the City of Toronto is diversity is our strength. Well, really, is it? I mean, it's nice, sounds pleasant, but what the hell does that even mean? And I mean, I can't define it, but there is this other part of the conversation where why aren't there, for example, young black men going into nursing, right? Are we going to put more quotas there because we want to diversify the nursing workforce? Why aren't young males, for example, going into being a daycare provider? Because there's already stereotypes about being a young man being a daycare. I mean, there's all of these things that exist that we don't have discussions about because it's uncomfortable. We don't want to be called racist. We don't want to be called this. We don't want to be called all these other things. So I think if you want to have an honest, true conversation, regardless of whatever size of your company, your corporation, what you do around your own kitchen table with your own family, Christmas is coming. You guys are all going to have conversations about things like this. I think most people are on board. They don't understand how to get there. They don't want to be called a racist. They don't want to be make other people uncomfortable, but they also don't want their freedom of speech stifled either, to be honest. And so that is, from my perspective, where I think so much of this discussion of diversity, it all sounds great, but it's not honest.
I think so 2 days ago, my 6-year-old daughter asked me, she said, "Mommy, why aren't there any male daycare teachers in her little brother's daycare?" And I was like, you're right. I couldn't answer. I had no idea. And then I thought back to myself and thinking, my son, would I encourage my son also to be a daycare teacher? And I have no reason I just hadn't thought about that. So to your point, you're right. It's this hard, uncomfortable conversation and truth that we probably don't even have with ourselves of how we think about it. And I don't know how do we have that conversation is probably what we should be talking about. How do we have that conversation? How do we bring the masses on board? How do we get them to understand or to relate to us or understand our differences? And I don't know what the answer is, and I don't know if anyone here has the answer, but that is something we really need to be thinking about. And I think it takes each individual person to think about it. So I thought about that for the last 2 days, and I didn't know what to tell my child, why there weren't any male daycare teachers in her school, and I still don't know what to tell her. But I think I'm more conscious of it, I'm thinking about it, and I think eventually, hopefully I'll have a good answer to it, but I think that's where we all need to go. We all need to think about it and strip the layer, and to Adrian's point, strip the layer of just talking about diversity. Really, what does it mean to each of us individually? It's nice for us to say it out loud, but what does it really mean, and what are we really as individuals doing about it?
And with a marketing hat on, I would say, we're talking about some great examples there where branding and imagery really plays into that. So, recruiting more men into daycares, or recruiting more women in tech, or the company that says, and I agree with your statement actually, I have seen many, many times where they'll too easily say, oh, but no women applied, or nobody of a diversified background applied, and they'll just accept that as is, instead of really challenging and saying, well, why is that? What is our image from a recruitment standpoint? Do we look like the kind of company that a woman would be attracted to? And really doing something to address that. But I think companies are not just going to, change their branding image and spend tons of dollars along the way doing so if they don't see the business case. So I think the answer really is working hard internally and from within and from at every level to look at that business case to say, well, by doing this, by attracting more women or by attracting people of different backgrounds, we're actually going to win. We're going to be more competitive, we're going to be stronger, and the numbers are going to really matter. And I think that's the answer to what's ultimately going to drive it. It's an economical answer.
And then just to take it back to some of the comments that were made earlier, so the point about being socialized from a very young age to, little girls behave a certain way, little boys behave a certain way, and it kind of translates up into boardrooms. Does kind of achieving a long-lasting and fundamental shift in companies require, as some of you have said earlier, that the companies themselves sort of change. So what we see as executive behavior, what we see, or does it require, or like, what's your opinion on that? Is it going to be sort of a longer-term shift in what we see as, as leadership and management, or something else?
So I think so. I was kind of reflecting on everybody's comments and hark back to your question. This is a marathon. It's not a sprint, right? I've worked in the tech industry for over 25 years, and when I started in technology, it was predominantly a male-oriented industry. And I've seen that shift over 25 years, and I realize it's a long time, and it's probably a couple of generations till you get through that. But it comes back to the education comment, right? So I think today we all try to push our kids into STEM. I have a daughter who's in STEM, and I have a son who's in arts. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think you have to find your comfort zone as a human being, and we shouldn't try to say, as a male you need to do this, and as a female you need to do that. And I think it's a journey that will take a long time to get there. I hate to be, unfortunately saying that, but it's not going to happen overnight. Quotas can impact it, but I don't think it really has the lasting impact that you want inside of your organization, because you want to build your organization from the bottom up, as you mentioned earlier, with talented people, which is a challenge today with millennials. They don't want to stay anywhere. I'm 11 years with this company, and people we hire today go, "You've been there 11 years?" I think it's changing, so it creates a great dilemma inside of it. But this is absolutely a marathon that we're going to run, and it's going to begin with constant change and evolution inside of organizations.
I think part of it is, though, what cultures bring from their own country. Like, I'm brown. Everybody thinks I'm either married to a doctor or I am a doctor. I mean, that's just, everybody in the Indian community, that's what they do. So it's cultural too. I mean, it's what people, it's their value system that they're bringing to this country when they come, because we have a country of immigrants. They all want their children to be more successful than they were, because they don't want their child driving a cab or whatever the case may be. So I think it's just, the adage, it takes a village, so perhaps that's very much true. It's just depending on what kind of village you're around, that whether you want it to help shape and shift your child into becoming, obviously, what we want is a productive member of society, with a job and a career and a family and their future. So I think it's more complicated than just we're taught certain things as boys, we're taught certain things as girls, or pick your pronoun for whatever we're calling each other these days. There is a broader discussion, I think, especially that we need to have within our education system, what's happening in public schools, what's happening in post-secondary institutions. I think that is, for me, from my perspective, where that societal shift will come.
Yeah, and I agree. You made a really good point earlier around the need. It goes far deeper than corporate culture or what we're doing, and it goes back to really a full cultural perspective. However, it is important, and I applaud the leaders around this table. We have to start somewhere, and if we just come at it from the perspective that it has to change completely from a societal perspective, and we're never going to make any progress until we get there, I actually don't buy that. So in my role, I have a responsibility as a human being, and a human being that works within this organization, to do what I can to change the landscape. And I won't. Suzanne Truesdale will not change everything for Canada. It's completely impossible. But I know the impact I can make as a leader within that organization, to make the team members that come to work every single day feel that they can bring their whole selves to work, feel that they can see that there's opportunity for them to grow their career within our organization if that's what they want to do, or they want to stay for a short time and build a skill set capability and then take that on to their next great role. I know we have a responsibility. We can't, to take on everything is a burden that is far too heavy for any one person or any one company. But I'm proud to see organizations in Canada put up their hand and say, you know what, this matters. And yes, we've only been talking about it, let's call it 5 years, in a meaningful way. But thank God we've started to talk about it, and thank God we've started to move the dial. We've got a long, long way to go,
but we'll never get there if we don't say we're all in and we're going to figure our way through it, and we're going to make it more than just great values or great statements, on our company boards, and we're going to put that into play, but we have to start somewhere.
So representation, we talked about that a little bit. Representation breeds accessibility for people to think about that space, whatever that is, being accessible. But wondered, Adrian, you mentioned that the ticking the boxes and all of that, it's kind of, there's obviously some problems with that just from a governmental standpoint, but how can we enforce that accessibility and having the representation shown through your companies and through your organizations without having those
So I would turn that back on you and ask you to define accessibility.
So recently I was able to kind of sit down with Arc'teryx, and we talked about brand strategy for them, and they wanted to talk about accessibility for women in the outdoor space and how there's not a lot of representation of women other than white women on, for example, their e-commerce platforms. So being able to represent other people helped bring more women into the space. So my question is, how, in your opinion, how can you find a better solution without having those targets, those boxes to check?
I don't have a good solution, and if I did, I'd be pretty rich. I wouldn't be in the newspaper business. I don't know. I think, well, actually, I won't be so flip about my response. There is a group of us in the news world. We often meet and we have conversations about those very issues. Not in the language by which you put it. Can everybody hear me, by the way? I tend to be quite loud. So not necessarily in that language that you put it in, which is far more thoughtful than the way we would. We talk about it more in the context of how we keep our reporters safe. So that's how we address it. So from what is a very thoughtful question, I don't have a perfect answer for you, but I can pivot to sort of acknowledge it in what we do as management to ensure that our reporters are safe. I had an incident about a month ago where one of my photographers was covering an Antifa rally, and he was concussed because he was hit by one of them. And so it sort of started this conversation about, okay, well, we have a responsibility to make sure people are safe, and then what tools we can give them in order to make sure that they still do their job, but safety first, sort of, and be situationally aware. And I think it's easy to have those. I think, well, not easy, but I think it's very plain to have those discussions. Often HR mandates them, as anybody knows who has an HR company, or HR in their company. HR will happily share whatever they think is their view on how to breed those sort of accessibility issues in that, what I think is a narrow definition of it. And that's really all I really could say on that for now. I'm sorry it's not as thoughtful of a response.
I think to Adrian's point, I don't think there's a good, clear-cut answer to it, but I just always feel like the onus and the responsibility is both on us as individuals and as an employer. So I've been a black woman in tech for many years, and I didn't really know or understand that I was a black woman in technology for many years, because very early in my career I put those blinders on and said, I don't care that I'm a woman, I don't care that I'm black, I just care that I want to be great at what I do. And I teach this to my daughter, no matter what you plan to do, just be great at it. And I've been able to progress in my career very successfully, and at my level now, I do look around and there's not many people who look like me, but again, I don't use that as, or think about that. I don't consciously think about it. I just think about, I just want to be great at my job. But now more and more, I think I want, even though I was brave enough or whatever I want to call it, to say, I'm going to put those blinders, not everybody can do that. So I want to make opportunities for other people to come up and so I coach my team, I coach my management team about it too, and say, these are not things that you just have to make sure that you succeed. Do your best and encourage people who underneath you to do their best as well, regardless of being a woman, and don't have that as a forefront for you to make that advantage. So we should be able to create our own accessibility. We should try and break down those doors as much as possible, even though again there is some onus on organizations to provide those opportunities, but we also need to not be discouraged because I don't see a lot of women there, I'm not going to do it. It should always be, I want to do it. And I think it's really, again, what we teach the next generation is going to be what's really important. I mean, our generation, we're going to have to fight for it, but I'm hoping that the next generation, it's going to be a little bit more easy for them because we've gone through it and we've kind of built the road for them and say, this is what you need to do to make sure that, you know, we do have those opportunities available to us as well.
Interesting, because I think brand responsibility is actually very important. And the reason why I say that is because I feel that, for example, in the space I'm talking with Arcturus, for example, we were all sitting around the panel and there was one black woman there, and she was a moderator actually. And Nina Nayuga, she's a really incredible human. You should look her up. But anyways, we were talking about how, so the lead brand strategist said, you know, it's really hard for us to find like a black climber. Like no one wants to be the poster child. And the response to that was, you don't need a poster child. This is a long-term game. You infiltrate on e-commerce like representation alone, just a couple of variations of different ethnicities, or you know, somebody with like a prosthetic leg, or all of these differences, but you don't make them that poster child. And slowly but surely, these become the normal. And I think that's the approach, at least in my opinion, that will really make a long-term game. This, as you said, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's a long, 20 years from now, that should be the normal. And I think having these enforcements in place is very important because it helps that become the new normal. Even if the intention or the way it comes across is kind of like sticky and corporate, which is the opposite of what everything these are supposed to be, but it does enforce change. So
I think normalization of it, that's really what it is. I mean, I've felt times where people have tried to talk to me about, like, how do you feel being the only black person in the room or the only female? And usually I said, well, I never thought about that. And you bringing it to my attention has kind of made me feel a certain way, because I don't want you to see me in that way. I want you to see me as somebody who's capable, who's earned her seat at the table, and not anything to do with me being black or me being a woman. So even though, and again, that's where it comes to this hard place where you do have to have those conversations, but then raising them as well makes us more aware of it, and then our biases kick in. And then sometimes I do kind of look around the room that I've never done before and think that, this room is only filled with, you know, people who are older white men and don't look like me. But I'm okay with that because I know I'm capable and I'm okay with it.
I think your question and the question of culture kind of fit together. You really do have to create a culture where this is just seen as normal, the norm. I think if there's anything that we've learned over 30 years, it's culture really gets leveraged by leadership behavior. And your question relates to, if it's not the tick box, then what is it? It's measuring leadership behavior. So there's a brilliant academic, talk about talent lost or brain drain. Her name was Julie Carswell. We lost her to the States about 10 years ago. She looked at the core competencies to create equitable and inclusive work environments. And she said, you really do it. She came up with 7 of them. And then Enron happened. And she realized, she watched the CEO of Enron do a lecture on the ethics and integrity of Enron. And then 2 days later, steal $20 billion from them. And she was like, oh, this has got to be a competency as well. But what I'm suggesting to you, the day-to-day behavior of leadership, and whichever way you define leadership in your organization, if that is not measured properly and looked, are you above the norm or below the norm, you will actually not create a culture for accessibility or almost anything else. And I also wanted to just, the point I forgot, this white hair is not Lady Clara. Obama. So Obama is one of my heroes. And 10 years ago, when he was thinking about running for president, and he came under a lot of pressure in this whole idea of being a black man, etc. And he made this statement at a press conference, and he said, for those of you in the press who think I'm a black guy from Chicago that's married, that has three kids, and went to Harvard, if you think that's who I am, you are missing it, because I'm a little bit more than that. All of those things can inform who I am, and none of them will define. So this notion of, yes, you're a black guy over 60 and you live in Toronto, so what? I mean, it's like, give me something else. You talk about millennials. I have 2 millennials, children, I mentioned them, that neither of them fit that stereotype about millennials. And so really what it comes down to is, you have to take me as the individual. So and that's really the big difference between diversity and human equity. Diversity was groups. The group of women over here, the minorities over there, the gays, lesbians, etc. Human equity is you have 7 billion groups in this world. I can say, who's the group Paul? Because he looks like a straight, white, able-bodied male over the age of 30. And works for a Korean whatever I see, that's not Paul. I can look at Paul's bio and I say, that's not Paul. That's 1/millionth of Paul. This is a unique combination of strengths, attitudes, personality, virtues, life experience that nobody else has. And if I miss that diversity, shame on me. So it's much bigger than just this cosmetic conversation. If only I had more women, if only I had some more black faces, we would get through. We've got to evolve this conversation. It's been around for 30 years. This is an old conversation. We have to evolve it beyond what we call diversity fatigue.
One more question and comment?
Natasha, you made a really good point in terms of marketing organizations are doing a really good job of presenting diversity in a unique way. In fact, the other day I was watching a TV commercial. There were 2 men holding hands on a TV commercial. 20 years ago, you would never see them, right? I talked to my parents about what diversity means to them. It's a different conversation than what I'm having with my kids, and it's going to continue. My question is actually for you, Adrian, in terms of what's mass media's accountability and responsibility when it comes to pushing the diversity agenda in the public. I still read newspapers, and I'm gonna go buy a Toronto Sun today as a result of you. But I still see the headlines that say black man shoots this, so what's your accountability as an editor-in-chief in reshaping the diversity agenda in the general public?
Well, you may not like my answer, but the facts don't care about people's feelings. If it is young black man shoots, that's the fact that I'm going to put in the paper. That's just a reality. I think, but we can't be irresponsible about it. Like, I'll give you an example. Over the course of the summer, we have had a number of shootings. And it's been predominantly young black males that have shot young black males. And we were putting together a front page, and we were looking at the victims and the alleged suspects. And I looked at it and I thought, well, I am not comfortable with this, because it was, 7 thumbprints, as we call them, just the little headshot of all these young black males. Not only, but sadly in this case, mostly. And I was like, I don't want to put this message out there. That's not the message I want to convey, because the victims are also young and black. So I flipped it. I put the victims on the front instead of the suspects. Because I have to be cognizant my front page is my storefront, right? That's the one you see in the little soldier on the street, the Toronto Sun box. That was my consideration. Was that fair? Maybe. Was it unfair? Perhaps. Was it my own bias? Without a doubt. And so, but that informs us in every newsroom, every day. But I have a duty and a responsibility to my readers to also provide them with the information. So, but by simply just changing it to the victims versus the perpetrators, I think it sent a better message that this is a very real issue in this city. It may not touch you, but if you're living in Jane and Finch, and if you're living in Flemington, these are issues that are happening all around the city. May not touch you down on Bay Street, may not touch you down in Rosedale, but this is happening in your city. So that's a decision I made. I think there is a broader responsibility with respect to those in the mass media markets, as far as magazines, and what we sort of perpetrate as our other own stereotypes. The one that comes to mind is Dove. I think they're very good at sort of showcasing the diversity of all of the women's body types and things like that, because God knows I'm not a tall, skinny white girl, and I never will be. So I can't live by that. So I think there's a responsibility in the news media, but there's an equal amount, if not more, responsibility in sort of the other side of the mass media that's more within the zeitgeist of what young people are going to consume.
So that's what I.
Sure. So I think we are coming up on 10 o'clock, and for the sake of getting everyone where they need to be after this, I would like to invite each one of our panelists to just give their concluding thought. Was there anything, for example, that you hadn't thought about that you thought about for the first time today, anything that you changed your mind about, or anything that you think you'll especially take away with you? Trevor, if I could start with you.
I haven't changed my mind on some of the things. It's a bit of a deja vu all over again. These were the conversations we were having 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So I still stand that this conversation needs to be evolved. Just to recap, the 3 points I was trying to make is that this is not a group conversation. It's about an individual conversation. If you have 300 people in your organization, you have 300 individual pieces of talent. The role of leadership is how do you unleash that talent for the mission of your organization. You can't do that just for women. You can't do that just for people in wheelchairs. You can't do that just for Indigenous people. I think the other thing is representation is a poor way of measurement, as Suzanne was saying, that it takes a long time, plus it's a lagging metric. And I think the conversation that Banerjee has put on, no group has a monopoly. No group has a monopoly on prejudice or discrimination. You know, I'm half Indian, half black. Okay, my wife was half black, half white. And I did not, the racism, I have faced racism in my life, of course. But most of the racism that I faced in my life is because I wasn't black enough to get to go out with Indian girls. And I wasn't Indian enough to get to go out with black girls, right? So I had to go out with lots of white girls. But I learned something. I learned something about racial prejudice during that period of time. And it's no fun whichever way you want to look at it. But this is not us versus them. This is all of us. Thanks for coming.
Natasha, we can.
Natasha and I were debating. I think a key takeaway today is just this sort of conversation around the diversity topic evolving. Before we get diversity fatigue, as you eloquently put it, and really moving on to finding solutions around the very broad spectrum of differences that we're actually looking at, rather than looking at differences on a per group level. So I still stand by that point that we need to find better solutions, and I'm not sure that we actually really got to a great number of solutions today. There were definitely some great ideas. I like the idea of management targets versus the quotas, and management accountability. But I think we're still a long way off from really pinning down what is the ideal recipe for success. And I still think it comes back to looking at the economical drivers ultimately, certainly at the corporate level.
And I definitely agree with Natasha. And I think one of the key things, my takeaway from here, and my challenge to all of us, is we really need to start with ourselves, individually, and that builds up. So again, I go back to the onus is not only on the organization to provide these opportunities or things for us. We need to provide them for ourselves. We need to think differently. We need to, every conversations we have with our employees or how we hire, we need to take that onus and responsibility on ourselves, and hopefully it comes from the bottom up and the top down, and we meet somewhere in the middle with a good solution, hopefully for the next generation.
It's an interesting perspective, and I think it's incumbent upon leaders to do this inside the organization. But I was coming back to what Elizabeth said earlier about children, and some of us in this room are parents, and some of us are about to become parents again. I think it's important how we provide an environment for them as children to be the future leaders in this world today. I grew up, and be quite candid, we used to joke, and my father's no longer with us, but he was Archie Bunker. I grew up with Archie Bunker as a white kid. And I moved to Toronto, and my first time in Toronto, I worked at a company that was incredibly diversified, and it was the most exhilarating experience for me as a human being, because I would go into the lunchroom and I have conversations with these people who had very different backgrounds than I ever experienced growing up as a white Anglo-Saxon male in Ottawa. And it was informative for me. And I want my kids to be that way too, and be open-minded and understand that difference is good. Differences actually create more value for you as a person and you as your company. And I think it's important for us to instill that in our kids today. I had a similar experience, Trevor. I moved to Toronto. I was dating a Greek girl, and I wasn't allowed to pick her up at her house because I was white Anglo-Saxon, which to me, I didn't understand that whole thing. So I think it's important for us as parents to get our kids to embrace, if we have children, and for them to carry the mantra forward into the next generation, that you shouldn't look at people. And I shared a story earlier today. Our head of HR in our company was talking to me the other day, and she said, what if we took resumes without names? We took the name off a resume. So I'm looking at your qualifications and your capabilities, not who you are whatsoever. And I thought it was actually a pretty thoughtful process. And I said, could we actually try to just white out the names and see it and take it through the organization and try it? So I think it's incumbent upon us to drive that into the next generation, which are our children and our grandchildren in some cases.
I love that you use the word whiteout. You and I are on the same page. So amazing. And carbon copies. Anyways, I digress. I've certainly appreciated the conversation for sure. And yeah, the conversation has been going on for a long time. I'm still really grounded and committed to, we need to move, perhaps we do need to move the conversation, but I think as importantly, we have to move the conversation from talking about it and really listening to one another and putting down more actions and delivering on those actions that we're committing to. Personally, I'm incredibly inspired by the young leaders around this table, and I know that this conversation and the actions that are going to come from it are in really, really good hands as I think about, me kind of, not right now, but, within the next 10 years or so, exiting this part of my life from a career perspective. And I would just encourage these incredibly bright, capable young women to carry that conversation on, because it is, to your point, Paul, it's an incredibly long marathon, right? And we have made progress, and I don't want anybody to think today, leaving here, oh my gosh, we just keep talking about it, nothing's happening. We need to pause and think. For those of us who are a little bit older than some people in the room, there has been a tremendous amount of progress made. Yeah, so I'm very inspired, and thank you so much for the invitation.
I'll keep my comments very brief. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. Thank you for not throwing anything at me. That's always a helpful start to my morning. I don't want you to take my candor and for flippancy. I just, this doesn't overwhelm the vast majority of people's thoughts. It just doesn't. It's an important discussion. I am optimistic about the future. I think that there are great opportunities for everybody. It was wonderful to hear from my fellow panelists, because everybody does bring their own perspective. Everybody does bring their own, what we call these days, lived experiences. And so that is what matters. And I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate the time, and I am very excited that I got one new subscriber for the Toronto side.
And so with that, I'd like to say thank you to the Bigwin Group for organizing. Thanks to the sponsors, Samsung and Reuters. Thank you to panelists and all of you for your attention, your thoughtful contribution, and for coming out early to talk about such an important topic. We hope that we've provided you with some food for thought, and that this will no doubt be an ongoing conversation, but hopefully more than a conversation, it will be action. And I'll turn it over to Hart.
I must confess that Rachel, you and I share a morbid sometimes fascination with the news. So it's sort of like disaster porn. You can't look away at times. And we live in a world of unfortunately polarity and some tribalism. And I'm not going to go too deep into this because
I'll get yanked off the stage here. But I think this is an important topic, and I wish, Adrian, that I was more optimistic, as you clearly are, that there aren't a lot of Luddites out there who don't embrace this topic from time to time, not day in, day out, but from time to time, and have thoughtful communication about it, as we've had today. And I want to thank Trevor in particular for giving me license to do that which I'm about to do, which is to tell you, as he shared with you about his children, he has one favorite. I got to tell you, this is one of my favorite panels that we've done, and as I say, we've done 17 of these, and I think that springs from the fact that you got some really sincere and passionate and believable comments from our panel. I didn't get a sense of people just spouting corporate lines. You could clearly see that this affects people on a very meaningful level at corporate, but beyond, with your how you talk to your kids. And I am optimistic that it's got to start earlier. And I hope that this panel, that this Sharpen Your Axe session has been informative. I didn't see anybody leaving early. That's always a good sign. And on behalf of our sponsors and our esteemed panel, the Bigwin Group, I want to thank you all for coming out and encourage you to join us on our next panel that's going to be coming up. Thanks very much.